Now we begin the World Watchers program. I'll repeat again, it's KAZU. Mae Brussell, broadcast number 640. It's March the 12th, 1984. We begin the program with a little bit of summary of what we were talking about last year. And this past year went so fast that the news just all flows together. It's hard to believe that these events took place last year, just 1 year ago this week. I was talking about the Nazi dentist who came out with new information in the Connecticut magazine, the March issue of 1983, and in the Houston Post, that he duped the Soviets and lied about the dental verification of Hitler's plates, that there were things that weren't told, the truth about Hitler's death, and the discrepancies of Hitler and Eva Braun. In fact, somebody, a listener of World Watchers, got me the information in the Connecticut magazine. It was hard to get, and the information from Hugo Blaschke, Blaschke, who graduated the University of Pennsylvania, the dental school there, who was Hitler's dentist, came from University of Pennsylvania, but I guess came from Europe to study there. He was a colonel in the SS. He died in 1957, and there's been new investigations to say that Nazis planted, in this we talked about last year, a look-alike near the bunker to confuse the Americans and the Soviets. Ha ha! They confused the Soviets because the Soviets thought Hitler died, but I think the Americans bought it also. So this article, there's a dentist at UCLA that we've done broadcasts on, and I'll update that with the material who talked about Eva Braun and that she did not die in the bunker. I can't believe that these two great lovers separated at that particular moment. It's hard to believe that. Then we talked about the shift of the Vatican Bank, the money shifting because of the death of Roberto Calvi. He died a year before in 1982, but there was a shift of money, and almost every week there's a transfer of money from the Vatican Bank to cover up the missing millions. And this article last year in the New York Times was talking about a $20 million secret transaction from the Banco Ambrosiano that the Vatican had. Last year we were talking about Reverend Moon and the Japanese mafia and his connections to Nazi and international funds. That's very important because I referred to Mr. Sasakawa last week, part of the Japanese mafia, when I said that Japan was bailing out the Vatican and Banco Ambrosiano at this time. The telephone is ringing in the studio, but I don't know whether they answered or not. I think we'll keep going, and because we are broadcasting this live and it is taped, and a little patience, call in next week and we'll get your call. Last week, talking about Reverend Moon and the Japanese mafia, I referred to book The Belarus Secret by John Loftus, where George Kennan was part of the American Committee for Free Asia, and he, in the book The Belarus Secret, it tells about his private and institutional war against the Soviet Union, and Kennan's work with Hitler's deputy foreign minister, who sent 1.4 million Jews to death, Gustav Hilgar. Kennan worked with him after the war, and Kennan worked with Ronald Reagan in the Crusade for Freedom as part of the CIA with General Clay. That was about Reverend Moon and the Japanese mafia and the Nazi connections. And also there is an article that I referred to last year on Alexander Haig greets a fascist rally, the World Anti-Communist League. Now, in that time, it's been exposed by Jack Anderson, thanks to him, as if we didn't know it before, but it's good to get it syndicated in maybe 300 papers around the country. The World Anti-Communist League was run and is run by General John Singlaub. At the time Haig was down there greeting them, identified as pure old Nazis from World War II, part of the Romanian Iron Guard. Singlaub is one of the directors of Western Goals, and they are the people working with the Los Angeles Police Department for security for the Olympic Games and putting into the data banks of their machinery from the police department anything they want from police departments all over the country. The only reason they were identified in L.A. was because of the lawsuit going on against the LAPD. And I talked about the links of Ronald Reagan, as I say, to these people. And then part of that broadcast was into a chronology from 1930 to 1959 of people who related and worked with each other, particularly narrowing it down to Dr. Hermann Urban, the Nazi since 1922, who joined the Gestapo, came to the United States, became a citizen, and then how he recruits Errol Flynn and the Hollywood group when Errol Flynn is making movies with Ronald Reagan. And the links of Urban, the Gestapo, Errol Flynn, Peter Drucker, who then brings in Fritz Kramer, who then indoctrinates Henry Kissinger into the war, their relationship to Dr. Joseph Mengele and Karl Wiedenbach from Germany, who goes on to Franco, Spain, and over with Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. This last broadcast, the sheet, the second side of broadcast 588 a year ago, is a very important list of names and dates of the interrelationship of the Moonies, the Nazi organizations, the politics of yesterday, and they certainly affect today, because one name on there is President of the United States, and that's Ronald Reagan. That's what we were talking about a year ago this evening. And just this week in the Washington Post, there's a story. The government is urged to back Reverend Moon's appeal. Reverend Moon had $1.7 million, or has, of cash in his own personal account. That doesn't have anything to do with his church. And he was drawing an interest of about $100,000 on that and didn't pay taxes on it. And he was supposed to make a fine and go to jail. Now, all of a sudden, some very heavy political people are out there saying, don't send Moon to jail. He's holding this $1 million. This is like Richard Nixon holding Bibi Rebozo's $1 million from the youth organization for Nixon and not paying taxes, holding it in a bank, not declaring it. Reverend Moon has his own fund. He has many millions. The important thing isn't that Moon has millions that he isn't paying taxes on like any other American citizen, or he was not an American citizen. He's certainly draining the economy. The important thing about Moon is that the people batting for him not to go to jail are Robert B. Anderson, who I've mentioned many, many times on these programs. Robert B. Anderson was a former Secretary of Navy, and he was part of the Rockefeller-Kissinger Special Study Group at Harvard University that Rockefeller set up with Henry Kissinger. And Anderson has hired Robert Keith Gray. I mentioned him just earlier on the talk show part of this program because Robert Keith Gray's name is in the memos with Mr. Edwin Meese as part of the recipients of stolen papers from the National Security Council that were taken from Jimmy Carter's offices under his administration, given to Ronald Reagan so he could give what looked like an intelligence debate against his opponent. Stolen papers, top secret papers, were delivered to Edwin Meese with his name and to Robert Keith Gray. And Gray worked, as I've had on earlier broadcasts and mentioned a few minutes ago, with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple. He worked with Edwin Wilson's office in Washington, D.C., and with George Bush as director of the CIA. They formed Task Force 157 and were closely linked to the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, with the syndicate, the mafia, the death squads, and the CIA all linked together, the narcotics traffic. And Robert Keith Gray is running a public relations firm and running Ronald Reagan's inaugural party, did before. He would like to do it again. So Robert Anderson has hired Robert Keith Gray with a history linking to the mafia, to the CIA, and to the Nazi teams, the death squads, and they want Reverend Moon off the cuff. That's why a year ago when I talked about the relationship of Moon, and I've done it many times, it's more pertinent to see a year later how they come to bat for him when they don't want him to pay taxes on his cash. Also coming to bat for him, if you think he's just a loony cult thing, which most of you don't believe by now, is Harvard law professor Lawrence H. Tribe, the former Internal Revenue Service Commissioner, Morton Chaplin, former Deputy Attorney General, Howard Tyler, former U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Vice President Bush, Fred Fielding, of the White House, and William French Smith, who's just ready to leave the Justice Department. They've been requesting that they come to bat and get Moon off these charges. He shouldn't have to be fined keeping that money and given an 18-month prison term or $25,000 fine. The fact that he keeps the money isn't surprising, and the fact that these people come to bat is one more example of not paying your taxes, just as Mark Rich, who owns 50% of Pebble Beach Del Monte Company, he went off with 100 million taxes and wouldn't pay it, and he's living in Switzerland rather than to pay taxes on oil profit. I should keep rubbing that in because it's tax time at this time next month. You should just about have it in the mail or be fine. So remember how these people get the bigwigs come back. Maybe you better call Robert Gray, PR office in Washington, to help you if you don't get to the tax office. Now, a news story broke this week, swinging away from last year, but going back to other broadcasts again. A former Klansman was indicted of the bombing of a synagogue. Did you see that? Joseph Paul Franklin. Now, how he ever got acquitted of shooting Vernon Jordan, I don't know. It was a clear-cut case. And Vernon Jordan, a black man who was in the company of a white woman, allegedly just to pick up papers at the office in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was shot in 1980. Franklin was acquitted of that. He was indicted this last week for bombing a synagogue in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It took place in 1977, and the Jewish group that was supposed to be there just happened to be late and didn't get killed. He said himself the purpose of the synagogue blast was to kill Jews, and he's been indicted. That's why his name's in the news now. He's a suspect in 13 homicides in 7 states. He's a suspect of shooting Larry Flint in 1978 in Georgia. And that's a interesting story because Larry Flint was offered the choice of either, of not exposing the Edwin Meese tapes with Vicki Morgan and so forth, destroy their tapes, and will prosecute the man who shot you. Now, it's more than that. Larry Flint knows all of the people, including the late Larry McDonald, that were behind this. And what they're letting this Franklin say is the reason he shot Larry Flint was he didn't like pictures of black and white people having sex with each other, which is not uncommon in the pornographic field. If you go to the bookstores, it's everywhere. But what Franklin didn't say is that he was hired to shoot Larry Flint 1 month after Larry Flint published the LA Free Press on the assassination. Franklin is a member of the Klan, and he's a member of the American Nazi Party. And the American Nazi Party was active with other German Nazis in the killing of John Kennedy, the very thing that Larry Flint was publishing about. In fact, Mr. Rockwell, the American Nazi Party, his name was in the notebook and phone address book of Lee Harvey Oswald. So this guy has now come forward, and he's whispering in the jail. He's leaking out the fact that he had a part in the shooting of Larry Flint. And there's an article in the paper representing Larry Flint in Lawrenceville where he was shot. And this particular gentleman, Mr. Huff, said that the reason he wants to talk and squeal is that if he's taken to Georgia for the trial, he'll have a better chance of escaping. If he is being charged for shooting Larry Flint, the people in Georgia will let him run out of the jail, and then he'll run out for shooting 13 other people. He's also serving a life sentence for killing 2 black people in Salt Lake City because they had white friends. That was in August of 1980. I would say if he were serving a life sentence, leave him where he is. If you bring him to any more trials, he'll run like a lot of these other people, and they'll never see him again. He'll get off on all of these other matters. So the comments are that he's confessing now because there'll be a deal and he can run away from the Georgia jail. And, of course, that's very easy to do. Now, last week I was talking about the Sumitomo Japanese Bank, the Japanese mafia bailing out the Vatican, or the week before last. I was talking about that. I didn't have time last week to update it. And how the Japanese, for the first time, are allowed to buy in the Swiss banks and take over a bank owned by Banco Ambrosiano and Licio Gelli, which really goes to Luxembourg. They don't have all the mafia connections of that bank in every newspaper article on the subject. But to update that story, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about that bank and another story about it in the news today, which is equally as interesting. The Washington Post has a story. The loan demand drops at home in Japan, and the big lead story is Japanese lenders bank on the United States. And the gist of the story is that the Japanese have so much money. Talk about rubbing it in, because we put all our money into rebuilding and arming Japan and said, you can't put money into weapons because you may become militaristic. So we'll rebuild you and pay for the weapons for a while until about last year, mostly, but we'll take care of you, and their businesses are booming. So this article really rubs it in by telling that Japan's 13 city banks have a combined profit of 15 trillion yen, which is like 64.4 billion. That's at a time when our banks are practically depleted of their cash. They're sitting there with 64 billion. So Japan has too much cash. So they're ready now. It's okay, the war is over. 1945, it's 1984. They're ready now to invest in the United States. This is Washington Post, March the 2nd, 1984. Japanese is ready to get into buy our savings account, our consumer credit financing. You'll be getting your loans from Japan like you got your cars, and you will lease from Japan. And they recently made an acquisition in the United States, the Fuji Bank, at $425 million for the Chicago-based Walter Heller International Corp., a subsidiary of Walter Heller. $425 million in Chicago. The Mitsubishi Bank bought the Bank of California for $82 million. So they're claiming they have surplus money they don't know what to do with, and now they're ready to come to the United States, and the Sumitomo Bank, one of Fuji's big rivals, is expected to decide how far they'll go, whether they'll set up their own banks in this country or whether they'll buy American banks. Well, with so many American banks on the verge of collapse, look how enticing that would be. Now, this article says that there's a change in the foreign exchange banking laws that opened up in the early 80s. That's when Ronald Reagan became president. And his career goes way back to Colonel Charles Willoughby and to General Electric and I.G. Farben. And he's loyal to them. You can't say he's not loyal. So in comes Reagan, 1981. He's elected in November 80 and takes the oath in 81. And then the banking laws change. Lo and behold, bring in your billions of dollars, and they can start buying up American banks and savings company, and they're starting American corporations. Now, just to let a little insult into that, we entertained the ambassador of Vienna just last week at the White House, and there was an article in the Washington Times. Austrian banker is sure the United States will cure its deficit. Mr. Hans Androsch, the chairman of Austria's biggest bank, says he has confidence that America can resolve the dilemma, listen to this, of spending that exceeds their income by $200 billion a year. A billion is a 100 million. We're spending 200 billion more than we have coming in. We can't get Mark Rich to pay 100 million on his taxes, and we're sending 8 billion down just to El Salvador and Guatemala. But we are spending that money. And Austria, another country that we had to rearm and take over and patronize Germany. When Germany and Japan lost the war, they took every cent out of their bank. Look it up in the Book of Records, the biggest emptying of money. It has it listed there as the biggest, not a bank robbery, but the emptying of every single bank in both countries. And they say, okay, America, you won the war. Now build us up or we'll be communists. So America starts putting out the cash, and we're exceeding 200 billion. And Austria, they sit back and say, I'm sure you can solve your problems. Well, give us an idea how. If we didn't start keep arming the world, we could solve it. But they must be laughing at us. And they're getting Reagan to spend more and more and more, which is bankrupting us more. And then Japan can come in and buy the bankrupt banks and the industries. And so can Germany. And so does Mr. Flick from Germany that I've talked about, pouring $350 million into J. Peter Grace and then put in American corporations. Now, in the book Facts and Fascism, David Emery up north, who has this book and keeps up with the research and has many radio programs on every week and has World Watchers on 2 stations up north in California area, he called me about George Seldy's book. 1943 it was written, Facts and Fascism. And that book had a chapter 4, The 5 Who Own Japan. And it's about the merchants of death. George Seldes wrote this in 1943. That was 40 years ago. Every Japanese gun, bullet, torpedo ship that has killed or wounded an American is cash in the money of Emperor Hirohito and a handful of people who make all the weapons in Japan. They not only are government officials, but they own the weapons. And this goes into Mitsubishi and Mitsu, and also IG Farben and their links to General Electric, and the story that George Seldes wrote up, which is true, about the weapons killing Americans, the weapon machinery, the profits of it goes into the people that run the government and the manufacturers and a handful of people. He says, when the merchants of death, the armaments manufacturers, had a financial interest in waging wars, they still do with fascist dictatorships. They were exposed as early as 1934 to be members of a cartel with reigning families and a large stockholder in the Mitsu and Mitsubishi. Hirohito owned 3,800,000 acres of land, and he also invested in the Bank of Japan, South Manchuria Railroad, Yokohama Specie Bank, the Mitsubishi, the Imperial Hotel of Tokyo, and so forth. There were several hundred members of cartels, but only 50 in Japan were powerful, and they linked with the United States, with Japan in their interests and shared the weapon system. It should be noted, George Seldes wrote, that American big business was found after the time of the First World War to be linked to Japanese big business through the Harvey cartel, which is Nobel, International Trust, and other agencies. Well, this goes right back to Otto Ambros and the Flicks and the Nobel, and also George de Mohrenschildt, whose father managed the Nobel interests. De Mohrenschildt was a fellow of the intelligence community who escorted Lee Harvey Oswald around and got him set in a position where he would be a patsy when John Kennedy was murdered. The Nobels affected our history and our elections and the people who worked for the Nobels in the future. American big business was linked to Japan through Harvey Steel, the Nobel Dynamite Trust, the munitions, and so forth. And according to the San Francisco journalist John Pittman, among the owners of the Japanese business was the International General Electric. Remember, it was the General Electric that put Ronald Reagan on week after week before they put him into this marvelous position of running for governor and then running for president. And this book tells about the Japanese financial oligarchy whose leading members are the Mitsu, the Mitsubishi, the Sumitomo, and the Yasuda, who are linked directly to fascism, so that these banks are now coming in. They have put away such surplus money, so much of it, that they're ready to move into the United States because of new banking laws of 1980, the early 80s, and they will be buying up, and you'll see more and more of it. And when the Pope in Rome wanted to be bailed out of an embarrassment with 88 banks in Europe that the Vatican owed money to, they went to Japan. So that is making a full cycle from the beginning of, after World War I, the Versailles Treaty, the cartels traded and built their empires, and then the beginning of World War II, and while that was going on, they were trading. And today, Germany and Japan, the so-called losers, are part of the trilateral with Chase Manhattan representing the Nobel interests. You have Chase and America, Japan, and Germany. But if we send out more cash, more than we have cash that we can bring in, then Japan and Germany have liquid cash that can take over our corporations. And just as the Japanese are bailing out an auto company in California, they'll help us out and they'll be loaning you money, probably low interest rates, to beat out the other American banks. It'll be interesting to see what happened, but this story just broke. Now, there was a big drug bust this last week in Kern County. I don't know how many of you saw it back east or elsewhere. It wasn't a wire service story. San Francisco Chronicle. 7 years of work to bust a pot ring. That it wasn't just marijuana, but they make it sound like it's pot. This big, 8 people were arrested, including a wealthy Kern County rice and cotton grower, and the man who helped arrange a Libyan loan for President Jimmy Carter's brother. Remember that scandal? They've been working on this case for 7 years. It involves a multi-million-dollar narcotic ring coming out of California to Mexico and Thailand with the man who helped arrange Billy Carter's loan for Charter Oil Company. Now, they've had 8 people arrested in the family. You remember George L. Bellumoni, Bellumoni, 58, millionaire, farmer and businessman from Buttonwillow, the alleged leader of the drug importing ring, Ronald Sprague, Bellamoni's son-in-law, who was the object of a Senate investigation in 1980 looking into the $220,000 loan from the government of Libya. Remember the great terrorists of Libya, Gaddafi, how terrible. Wilson and Turnbull working over there, arming them. As I say, that Robert Keith Gray working with the Libyans. Okay, here they are with the Carter family in 1980, and goodness knows this has a tangled network. Of course, it links to a larger drug operation. $220,000 loan to Billy Carter from the government of Libya to Billy Carter, the brother of the president. And it involved John Wyatt. Remember, he was arrested, a former Bakersfield High School baseball and football player, and his wife. They got $1 million a year supervising the growing and smuggling of marijuana. And they have a furniture company, the Thai-Cal Trading, in Bakersfield, which is from Thailand. The purpose is to launder drug money. This story broke just this weekend that this group of 8 people, family members, son-in-law, and daughter-in-law and so forth, are part of a Thailand, Mexican, narcotic, multi-millionaire, lots of millions of dollars into their hands in Kern County, linked to Billy Carter in over there in Plains, Georgia, just doing his thing for Charter Oil. Now, there were 2 deaths related to this particular operation that I had on the air last year. I knew it was a big story. You might have known it. But the story that broke said they've been working on it 8 years. So no wonder these crashes went down. One I had on broadcast 559. It was Mexican officials investigate a plane crash that killed 7. This is a crash where the bodies were strewn at least a mile apart. And on the plane was Elmo Bellamoni of Buttonwillow, a businessman and farmer and a partner of the family of director of the bank corporation, the Community First Bank of Buttonwillow, and his younger brother George, who wasn't on the plane, was arranged the Billy Carter loans for the Charter Oil Company in 1980. So this article mentioned the links of the Charter Oil, not the one of the arrest this week. The brother and other members of their operations coming back from Mexico, a real estate and insurance agent from town, and a group of people. Goodness knows who the passengers on that plane were, but we know who one of them was, who at the time was working with Billy Carter when he was being investigated. And they all were blown up 2 years ago, but it didn't. The arrest just took place of the whole family and the entourage of the group working with them just this past week. Then there was another murder of the Charter Oil executives that got the loan that were working with the Robert Besco, Billy Carter, drug connections. Now, this may sound complicated to you. Let me reduce it to its simplest forms. A group of 8 people have been arrested in Kern County, multi-million-dollar narcotic operation involving Thailand, Mexico, and where they go from there, goodness knows, out of Bakersfield, California, hometown of Chief Justice Earl Warren, where they never investigated in Kern County properly the murder of his father. We've talked about that before, but not to digress, big arrest. Now, the article mentions this Bellamoni family, and just 2 years or 3 years ago, that plane, while they're in the process of being investigated, that plane blew up over in Mexico. Now, another accident happened, and I had on broadcast 1982, 558. Charter Company president, Charter Oil president, and 4 others die in a plane crash over Ireland. The president of Charter Oil, who was involved with this loan that Billy Carter got from Gaddafi, the executive vice president, the senior vice president, the charter founder, and chairman of Charter Oil were all killed. And keep in mind, one plane crash was happening in March, leaving Mexico, and one in July over Ireland, and the Charter Oil was involved with this narcotic deal. And then I had a broadcast several years ago, Robert Besco was linked to the $2 billion deal between Charter and Libya. And when you get Besco, you get another factor, somebody like Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for Robert Besco, and then you really get into the CIA operation aspect of this. Chicago Tribune, the April 7th, 1980, James Coates, there's a $20 million a year scheme that involves Robert Besco in exile in the Bahamas and working with Billy Carter and Charter Oil and so forth. Now, the Bahamas is where the Vatican money was missing the 1.2 billion or over $100 million from 10 dummy fronts. And Paul Marcinkus, the Vatican banker, wasn't one step removed, nor was Jimmy Carter, who brought in and escalated this Polish Pope with Mr. Brzezinski, and the Vatican connections to Jimmy Carter were very, very close. The connections of Gaddafi to the Pope are close. What you have is a triangle of Charter Oil, Gaddafi, the Vatican, and out here in California, Thailand, one more speck, a grain of sand on that fabric brought up in that book on in Banks You Trust, or the scandals of these interlocking banks of the Nugan and Banco Ambrosiano. This drug bust just took place, working, as I say, 8 years on it, a lot of deaths. Goodness knows how many other people have died. That's just a fraction of the story. But that was an interesting arrest, and I'm surprised they had the nerve to do it. But the Republicans do arrest the Democratic drug dealers because the Republicans are in, and when the Democrats are in, they arrest the Republican drug dealers, and we've talked about the drug wars and politicians. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back to some other important news. Now we're on side 2 of this broadcast. This is number 640. It's March the 12th, 1984, KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. I'm going to spend the second half of this broadcast and maybe all next week and the week after on Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Police Department, and the Olympic Games. I think it is the most important story in the country. I think the Grenada invasion was a practice for what our country can do to invade any single country, and testing its secrecy with the press, and a lot of other things that they did. And I've spent the last 3 months on the Grenada invasion. And when I write that up, then I'm going to do extensive work on the LAPD up to and through the time of the Olympics. Now, a subscriber to World Watcher sent me a clipping, innocent enough, but it tells you a lot of things, from the Sunday Oregonian, February the 12th, 1984. It's about a woman named Annette Jolin, Jolin, and her father visited her this summer. His name is Manfred Schreiber, Schreiber, and he came to visit her in Oregon, and he's here from Germany, from Bonn. He heads the West German Federal Police in Bonn, Germany. At the present time, he's the chief of police in Bonn, Germany. And he went to visit her in Oregon, and then he was going down to Los Angeles, where he had a meeting with the Los Angeles Police Department. He was attending an Olympic security conference in Los Angeles as an advisor to the Los Angeles Police Department for security for the Olympic Games. Bonn, Germany is sending their chief of police to tell in California how to secure yourself for the Olympic Games. Now, the important part about this story is that he was the chief of police in Munich, Germany, when the Israeli athletes were murdered. And the excuse for the government spending $100 million for security is because 11 Jews were killed in Munich. I can't believe that all the airplanes and all the guns we're getting would be to protect 11 more Jews. I just can't believe that life is that precious. When you're sending 90 million to Guatemala tomorrow and 100 million to El Salvador, I can't believe that life is that precious. I think they have other things in mind. So Manfred was not only chief of police in Munich when this was allowed to happen, but he's also in Bonn, chief of police. But it goes on to say that his daughter is following in her father's footsteps. Annette is in this country, not in Germany, and she teaches at the Oregon Police Academy, and she's working on a doctor's degree in urban study criminology at the Portland State University. Now, maybe there is a kind of there's sexism and racism. Maybe it's a thing where I think Americans should study police on Americans. I don't appreciate the chief of police of Bonn having his daughter work up to be the chief of police of Portland, Oregon, while the Japanese buy the banks of Oregon. It says she just completed her term as first chairman of Portland Police Internal Investigation Audit Committee, which has to do with intelligence and spying, getting a doctor's degree at Portland State University. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's an American citizen. She's going to run the Oregon police. I just feel very uncomfortable with it. Not that single news story or anything else about it, but add it all up, where the guy came from and where he's going, and advising there with his daughter with the Oregon police. Now, you can get really paranoid. A week after I read that article that was sent to me, I got another article from Gresham, Oregon, February the 18th, 1984. The police killed a man and the charges are dropped. A town in Oregon where a 27-year-old was shot and killed. His name is Mark Stomps. He wasn't armed. The police shot him, and they thought he was a man they were afraid that he was going to kill himself. There was some call or something. His mother said he was threatening to kill himself. So he's out in the street. He has no weapons, and he's shot by the police with this incident. Not once, but 7 times they gunned him. You know, not the feet to stop him from running or whatever, or the hand if he's holding anything. He had no weapons. So the Oregon police not only killed a man 7 shots, he hadn't committed a crime. They could have used some kind of a gas to subdue him. He had no weapon, and the police were not charged. So if I subscribe to an Oregon paper, I guess I could get really paranoid about the Oregon police, but I don't like it. Now, I'm going to do a series of articles on the U.S. Olympics, on the LAPD, in somewhat of a chronology as they're running, and share with you what is coming down there and what has been happening in the last 2 months that I haven't updated. The story from the Los Angeles Herald: the United States is to supply official helicopters for the 1984 Olympics. The Defense Department is going to provide 30 helicopters for the Olympic Games. They can expand more if they want. The Defense Department can supply the weapons from military or civilian sources under $50 million appropriation from Congress. Congress has put up this $50 million for weapons or whatever. Our Congress has voted for the Los Angeles Olympic Games. Keep in mind, we're talking about 2 weeks of people running around the track. Then I'm sure you saw the Olympic trials in the paper this week in the San Francisco Chronicle and over the wire services and on television. They have 2 dummy terrorists standing up in booths, and a man is playing the role of a terrorist, pretending to be a hostage, and they're practicing in Quantico, Virginia, on how to take care of these terrorists. UCLA will shut down nuclear reactor during Olympics. This is San Jose Mercury last week. The University of California has a nuclear reactor, and the question is, what in the heck are they doing with that right in a highly concentrated residential area? They have highly enriched uranium on a college campus. And there's a quotation from an assemblyman: I still believe that highly enriched uranium has no place on a college campus. Well, UCLA is just a few miles, and it's surrounded by homes and businesses. And they have a nuclear plant there. Now they're going to barricade it by concrete with constant guards, because the barracks where the Olympics will be going in July 28th to August the 12th. We'll have to keep putting those dates down. This is where they keep the uranium, and a lot of the visitors will be staying in Olympic villages nearby. So they've conceded to close down the uranium and the nuclear plant on a campus. Can they remove that out in the hills? You drive between San Francisco and LA, and there's all this bare space. It seems to me that some kind of a nuclear facility doesn't have to be in the middle of Westwood. It's just horrendous. And another story: the FBI shows off its hostage rescue team. In several of the demonstrations last week, this is from the LA Times, they used live ammunition to shoot and kill dummies to show how they're going to use this explosive and how strong their weapons are. And they have a new weapon that shoots through walls if they want to kill a hostage. So they're demonstrating how clever that is, showing off their weapons. They're putting a fortune, and I think it's really a carnival to parade the weapons. I can't imagine much more about that. Now, a while back, I didn't get a chance to put on the air all of the information. I never will get the complete amount on Lieutenant Thomas Scheidecker, who was apprehended for taking papers home, and he was in part working with J. Paul from the police department, taking papers home from the police files and the intelligence files that were put into computers that go to Western Goals. And I mentioned that he is part of Navy intelligence and Navy Reserve. And there were papers that he takes from the State Department that I mentioned and agencies under what he calls the Threat Analysis Group. And these documents are marked confidential and end up in the Los Angeles Police Department with Lieutenant Scheidecker. And then he gives them to J. Paul, who hands them to John Reese, maybe one of the top spies in the United States, and the John Birch Society. And they go to everywhere from Roy Cohn on Western Goals with the Mafia to Admiral Moore, the former chief of staff, or General John Singlaub with his Nazi Mafia group headquarters, the World Anti-Communist League over there in Taiwan, working out of Taiwan and also the Philippines. Now, I mentioned Scheidecker's role of taking 10,000 papers home that were top secret, and the excuse that he gave was he used the documents for planning the Olympic Games security. Now, I'm going to keep citing these different people in these different articles because how can you have security for games when you're handing information about these people right to Munich, Germany, right to the Galen BND, and to Vienna, where the lack of security happened at the last Olympic Games? Besides Defense Department papers, he took home confidential reports. He's not supposed to do that, and I have mentioned this to you before. Lieutenant Scheidecker is Lieutenant Commander in Navy Reserve Intelligence, and so that would be under John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, close to Henry Kissinger and Lord Peter Carrington. Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer, and then Kramer, the partner of Daniel Graham. And here is Mr. Scheidecker holding the papers from the Defense Intelligence Agency and feeding these computers, going to William Medigovich. And I mentioned him several times, and I will continue. He is a CIA staff officer who is now in charge of the Office of Emergency Service. And you wonder how many people down the line get these papers once they leave the Los Angeles Police Department. Another article on the LAPD that was in the LA Times, police official says Los Angeles cop misused his job, and he abused his job. Both words were used. Detective J. Paul abused his duties and could face disciplinary action. Do you think he will or not? For storing intelligence documents outside the police department and for his unauthorized ties to the right-wing intelligence Western Goals. Well, after this article was written, police agents came out and said it was authorized, that they gave him these papers and told him to keep them, and that they have 3 satellite stations where they take papers out of the Los Angeles Police Department. Also among Mr. Paul's possessions were police infiltration counterintelligence documents dating to 1974. So it couldn't be pertinent work, and that goes back to the early 70s, and he's pushing these names into the computer back to Alexander, Virginia, and into the general international computer of who the leftists or the liberals are. The 11 proposed misconduct charges are that he passed information from the Los Angeles Police Department to the late Representative Larry McDonald, who was gunned down just 18 days before he was to testify, and to John Birch Society and John Reese, that he lied and made false misleading statements and denied giving Western Goals the information. See, if it was for the Olympics or security, but he lied that he was doing it, and if he was told to do it by the police department, he wouldn't be charged with lying. He's being charged with false and misleading statements, denying he was being paid by Western Goals. At the same time, he was being paid by the Los Angeles Police Department, that he was working without a valid department permit for taking employment outside, being on a salary to a right-wing institution headed by the president of the John Birch Society and boarded by known Nazis and a member of the Luftwaffe and Roy Cohn of the crime syndicate, that he made false and misleading statements with his relationship to Western Goals. These are his charges, and his attorney, and he improperly possessed police intelligence documents in his home and his garage. His attorney says these charges are an insult to a reasonable man's intelligence. The findings are not supported by the Internal Affairs interview, and that at his home there was a virtual library of intelligence-related information on judges, civic leaders. We'll go into some more of them later, and civil libertarians. Well, J. Paul did have them in there, and while he was denying, the police was denying they didn't give permission, the punchline of the story was, of course, they were giving him permission. Another article follows officer in LAPD spy case. This is one's the LA Herald. This is similar to the LA Herald, the LA Times. Sometimes the same day will run a story if you're lucky, and some days they alternate with each other. LA Herald, this follows that earlier one. LAPD detective loses his bid to stay on the job. He's temporarily suspended. J. Paul won't be fired, or else he'll be the fall guy for them. He's been temporarily suspended while he works on his defense to show that the police told him to take the information to Western Goals, a private foundation away from the police department. And there was a suggestion that Paul even worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. Ooh, heavens forbid, the CIA is getting this information. Well, the CIA has it anyway, but J. Paul works for the Defense Department. This goes to Admiral Moore and Edward Teller and the father of the H-bomb. But this article suggests that he's a CIA agent, and that was the first time it suggested, or the fact that he may lose his job. Then he was temporarily suspended. He isn't out yet. Don't worry. Another story followed that. Police probes glare falls on the detective at the center of the spy case. And all of a sudden they wanted to zoom in, this is from the Los Angeles Times, and make him the center of it, whereas it turns out he was working with the high officials, and they told him to take the stuff home and use it and feed it into the conservative Western Goals. This is an article from the LA Times on how he took the documents, fed them into the computer, and at that time, Chief of Police Daryl Gates was still staying away from it and not pursuing the matter and acting as if he did it on his own. This was just about 2 months ago that they were still saying that he was acting on his own, and they did a disciplinary hearing that was unmatched in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department because it was full of contradictions. Then a large article came out where he got tired of being made the patsy, and 3 days later, the Los Angeles Times had an article, January the 27th. Spying case figure says the police brass supported his activities. And then he came out, J. Paul, and said, my superiors encouraged him to be with the right-wing Western Goals Foundation that has a list on everybody who's signed up with labor unions or anti-war movements or anti-nuclear. The police told him to do it. The Police Intelligence Division knew that he spent his days while he was on salary and at his wife's law office in Long Beach, Mary Love is her name, working on a computer, paid by the Los Angeles Police Department and putting information into a computer that goes to Germany and Vienna. Think about that. And Washington, D.C., and to Mr. Singh Laub of the World Anti-Communist League that I was talking about a year ago, or this year, Jack Anderson is talking about, with the top Nazis from World War II. This article says J. Paul was helping Western Goals build a massive database on political leftists. This goes back to 20 years of politics in California, and they need a massive database. Lieutenant Elmer Schiller, Schiller, had direct knowledge that the computer for $100,000 that was bought that J. Paul was using belonged to Western Goals. The police department knew it. I mean, you can know the difference between a Radio Shack computer and a $106,000 computer, and Lieutenant Schiller was assigned to the Anti-Terrorist Division in charge of the Olympic Games. That the Anti-Terrorist Division replaced the police intelligence that J. Paul worked with because they used the same people. They changed their name when they were being investigated. J. Paul named many officers who knew the intelligence. This is in a story where he got tired of being the fall guy. And the charge of perjury may come in because his first testimony said that the superiors didn't know. But being as they're pinning so much on him, they may charge him with, yes, they did know, which is a minor perjury considering how many top cops were in on this. The information fed into this, keep in mind, is all law-abiding citizens, information on the radical left, and what J. Paul wanted to show was that the police department knew what he was doing, that everything he had was on with their permission, that he is being unlawfully singled out, and he was getting sick of it. By the end of January, just a month and a half ago, he was being singled out for a discriminatory prosecution, and he's sick of it. He said 6 superiors knew. He got the final okay to work outside, and he worked with Captain Robert Loomis, who was over him before Mr. Scheidecker took over. and Loomis received the approval from the chief of police, Darrell Gates, or the assistant chief of police. So he got tired of being the fall guy, and he said, yes, they had knowledge, and they told me to work on it, and I drew the double salary, and what are you going to do about it? And then that was January the 27th when this story broke in one newspaper, and then another story broke about J. Paul breaking his silence, and some more information about the logs that show where he was, and his police logs in the police department showed that he was working in Long Beach. Instead of coming at 9 o'clock, the LAPD, he was in Long Beach, and that's on the logs, and he said they didn't stop him, they encouraged him, and they used the resources from Long Beach. In other words, it turns out Western Goals from Alexandria, Virginia, is putting names in the Los Angeles Police Department for people to go after. So he got a little more angry within the time that he knew he was going to be a patsy, and said they knew where the money came from, the logs showed where they came from. And this is very important, again, to go back to the security of the Olympic Games, because the excuse was the Olympic Games and all these weapons and all the money, $100 million for security of the Olympic Games. And what J. Paul said at the end of January was, I received authorization to use the city time to work outside the division that Mr. Loomis told him that the chief personally approved, and that he was doing this on the approval of the police department. Then by January 28th, a day later, J. Paul implicated more superiors, and he mentioned people in the police department, and all of them that were over him are referred to as the former police. They've all scattered around into different departments of the police department, and he began to name other agents, in addition to Robert Loomis, who knew about Western Goals, who approved of it, that he was helping the ultra-conservative organization, and then they would send information out to California from all over the world that the California, Los Angeles police could use and would be always very grateful for, which is an interesting phenomenon. The Los Angeles Police Department story continued into February. I'm updating you these stories in chronological order. A judge finds his name in the LAPD files. This is Municipal Judge Ernest Aubrey, in looking over the records of what's going on in Los Angeles, found his name in the files. That's not all. There were 4 judges in the file, law-abiding citizens. They're judges, but notes about the judges and their past, and some were taken off cases or were removed from cases, and the police department, it seems to control the courts in Los Angeles with the information of Western Goals being fed to the police and vice versa. They have massive computers. And Municipal Judge Ernest Aubrey, a law-abiding citizen, found that his name was in the Western Goals computer run by the late Congressman Representative Larry McDonald, but still a very active board at Western Goals and the John Birch Society, and so was L.A. City Councilman Zeb Yaroslavsky, who is mentioned in those computers. Remember this story that they had information in the police department there was a hit squad that was going to kill him, and the LAPD had notified him. Well, he's the Jewish councilman from the Fairfax area, so I imagine if they wanted to get a Jew, that would be a good one to knock off. They had his name on the list and didn't warn him. Another story in February, a month ago, commander wants second officer to face charges. See, until that time in February, just a month and a half ago, J. Paul was the only patsy. Then they brought in Lieutenant Thomas Scheidecker from the Navy Reserve, who has all these boxes at home, but wasn't even suggested as being charged with anything wrong. And they're saying that he had negligent supervision of J. Paul, and that he improperly stored documents at his home. And they considered charges of having 42 classified documents from the Defense Intelligence Agency. That's Daniel Graham and the Fritz Kramer. He's retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency, but the Western Goals files with John Reese go back and forward in the LAPD into the 60s and 70s, and specific police information, and he worked with Navy intelligence. Another article in February, 2 retired Los Angeles captains are blamed for not keeping J. Paul or Scheidecker under control, and they begin to finger their supervisors and get a little higher up now. Instead of Scheidecker was in charge of J. Paul, but he personally inspected Paul's database with the computer, and he assured the police department that the information that they had been dumped. Now, this is Scheidecker, I mentioned many times. By February, it came out that material that was supposed to be, remember the early reports of the 60s and 70s were supposed to be destroyed? Well, in February, this is in the LA Herald, February 8, 1984, Scheidecker took all the information from the police that was to be dumped, and instead it was fed into the Western Goals computer. If you think the 60s and 70s are dead, wait for the 80s, because these people have computerized names in everybody, let's say, who was on a leftist or a liberal cause. The right-wing intelligence gathering outfit that Paul was assembling was both for the police department and for Western Goals. It was a mutual relationship, and Scheidecker knew the material was to be dumped. It just came out this week in the newspaper that charges are dropped against Scheidecker. They're not going to do anything to him. The whole police department should be changed because they were the intelligence group, because they were supposed to destroy this information. Another officer was to testify in the spying case February the 10th. This is a story from the LA Herald. By linking the Los Angeles police with Western Goals Foundation, the Los Angeles police was engaged in discriminatory enforcement against left-wing groups. The police will not make these men face a trial board. They decided in the middle of last month that they can be back on the job. Scheidecker's back on the job, no penalties, nothing for the illegal removal of files. And they said, well, 1 year statute of limitations ran out. Well, who knew where they put the files until the ACLU case came up to find out where the police files were, to find them in J. Paul's garage just last May, a year ago. Another story in the Los Angeles Times, J. Paul's boss won't testify at hearings. Mr. Captain Robert Loomis, who was in charge of him, is in Nevada, and he went to Los Angeles police and testified in January. And just this last month, he said, I'm not going to come back anymore. I don't want to answer your lousy questions. So J. Paul's lawyer said, well, we can drop the whole case. If you don't come to testify, Mr. Loomis, then nothing you say matters. We can drop it. And he says, well, I'm not going to leave Nevada. I got business to do. So this week, Chief of Police Daryl Gates said, okay, the city of Los Angeles will spend $3,000 and bring the court transcriber and our hearing to Lake Tahoe in Nevada. This guy isn't even forced, no subpoena, to come down and appear when he was working with the man who was taking 140 boxes to his garage, and Scheidecker had 10,000 papers or files in his home and in their car, and they could disseminate into computers in what they called 3 satellite stations with names of people who don't even dream their names are in these records. So this guy, Loomis, says, I'm not going to appear, and they said to him, this week you will appear, we'll go up and see you, so that's offing now. Another story, late in February, J. Paul backed on storing data at home, and now the hero comes forward, and who gave him the permission? Lieutenant Charles Kilgo, K-I-L-G-O, now retired. They all retired. Loomis retired, Kilgo retired. They all stepped aside. He authorized J. Paul to take home the police intelligence files. He said, I had no problem with him having these documents. Well, he had no problem with them. It was my name in them. I have the problem with them. He doesn't have the problem with them. He says, I don't have any problem giving them to him. Kilbo was in charge of the division's records. He set the record-keeping system, and he authorized Paul to take the documents to his home or other places. He didn't care where he took them. This is the LA Times, February 24th. Scheidecker followed Mr. Kilgo as the custodian of the intelligence records for the second largest city in the United States police intelligence, and J. Paul was authorized by Captain Loomis to use the computer furnished by Western Goals, and late Larry McDonald, the John Birch Society, and Scheidecker said it was a prerogative of individual intelligence officers to determine when and to whom information could be passed along. The individuals can decide when and to whom, so that when you're on a list and the police think you have not committed a crime, but you're being patriotic and using the First Amendment to speak up, write articles, write letters to the editor, along come this gang and say it's their prerogative to do what we want, He can take them where he wants. I don't have any problem with it, and he can have them. And the arrogance of these people as the case warms up gets worse all the time. I'm going to continue next week some more on the LAPD story because the files continue to escalate with letting Mr. Scheidecker off and then hushing up this case a lot because the Olympic Games is coming, and Mr. Scheidecker said the reason he took this material home was that he wanted to use it for Olympic Games security. And again, I asked the question, how secure can you be for the Olympic Games? I do think that the continuous expose of the biography of people on Western goals, which I've done and touched about a little bit in the article on the Korean airline and Larry McDonald, the Los Angeles Police Department, the record of the 60s and 70s going back to the Cohn program and Operation Chaos. That's what's in these files. I think we should talk about it and those people and continue with the articles. There's $100 million for 2 weeks of security at the Olympic Games, and I think we better watch who has the money and what they're going to do with it, and their links to former terrorists who are currently waiting to come on the scene. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. We'll sign off now, and I'll be back with you next week. Take care of yourself and read the paper and the news, and we'll be together 1 week from tonight.